A 17-year-old girl testified Wednesday she was forced to write 2 confessions and kiss a Bible before she was shot. Beverly Charist told a coroner's jury Russell Spears turned his rifle on her seconds after shooting an RCMP constable as he approached Spears' cabin near here. It was the first time the girl had testified in public. Beverly was one of 5 witnesses who testified Wednesday at an inquest into the death of Constable Neil Bruce of Kelowna. Jury heard evidence 2 hours before, ruling that Bruce died of complications caused by a bullet wound from a shot fired by Spears.
In November 1872, Robert James Spears was born to parents James C. Spears and Margaret Kennedy. By the age of 24, Robert married a woman by the name of Mary Haslett, later having at least 5 children with Mary. Their firstborn was Robert, who was born 2 years after their marriage in 1896. After settling in Tara, Ontario, the pair had children Emma in 1900, Russell in 1906, Gordon in 1915, and Ethel in 1917. In 1931, Russell married a woman by the name of Elise May Farrow. She was 20 at the time and took her husband's maiden name. Later the same year, they moved to Kelowna, British Columbia. During the marriage, he had 3 children with Elise, a daughter in 1938, a son in 1933, and information on the third is unknown. Russell Spears was about 130 pounds, 5'4", with graying brown hair and hazel eyes. Throughout his time in Kelowna, he was not known as a good man. Before the assault, shooting, and 9-day manhunt that led to his death, Spears had 6 known criminal convictions to his name. In 1935, Spears was convicted of carnal knowledge. This charge was unclear, as carnal knowledge can be defined from statutory rape to intercourse with someone under the age of consent. This charge does not necessarily mean that sex acts were unconsensual, but does imply unlawful sex acts with another. The charge was briefly mentioned in a news article after his death, stating the mentioned charge involved a young girl. It's unclear if Spears was incarcerated for this event. In 1938, Spears was convicted of rape. Details are sparse on this charge for protection of the victim involved, though it's likely Spears was incarcerated. After Spears' run-in with the law, Elise would become frustrated with the behavior of her husband and divorce Spears in 1943. It's important to remember that this was 1940. Divorce proceedings were very different, and it's likely that Elise left Spears years before the formal divorce. Elise had assumed custody of their children, leaving Russell to himself in BC, later marrying a man by the name of Melvin McLeod. The two had at least 1 child together and lived happily until Melvin's death in 1989. In 1948, Spears was incarcerated with assault with intent to commit rape. The timeline for the following events is unclear, though it's believed that he escaped custody while awaiting for trial for this offense on the 14th of November, 1948. After the escape, Spears was on the run from the RCMP for a month. He had built a shack roughly 90 meters from the home of a millionaire rancher while on the run. The location of the shack is unclear, though it's thought that the shack was built in the rural woods of Kelowna. On December 14th, a local to the area stumbled across Spears' shack while harvesting Christmas trees, subsequently alerting the authorities. The local RCMP swiftly responded, though Spears wasn't going down without a fight. A shootout ensued. Spears shot at 2 RCMP officers, striking Sergeant Bob Mercer through the arm. Spears, unscathed, once again eluded police after the shooting and was at large until the 5th of January 1949. It's unclear how the RCMP located the fugitive the final time. Fed up with Spears and concerned for their safety, the RCMP officers approached the situation with lethal force. As the officers closed in on Spears, he was shot through his left knee. Based on a suspect description from 1965 stating that Spears had bullet scars on both legs, it's thought that Spears was shot multiple times during this shooting. Spears was taken to hospital where a successful operation was performed to save his leg. He was taken back into custody and subsequently charged with escaping custody in 1949. Additional charges were likely filed as a result of the shooting, though public knowledge regarding the convictions is minimal. It's unclear how and why Spears continued to be released back into the public, but unfortunately sometime before 1959 he was once again. That year, Spears gained another charge for contributing to juvenile delinquency. Again, details on this charge are unclear. Considering his criminal past, it's not likely that the juvenile in question was one of his children. In addition, his known children were over the age of 18 at the time, suggesting Spears was involved with an unrelated minor in some capacity. There are no details to suggest that Spears was incarcerated for this offense, though by this time in his criminal career, Spears had likely been on parole and/or probation for some time now. Again, Spears continued to have access to the public. It took only 3 years to obtain his next charge in 1962. Spears molested and likely raped an 18-year-old Kelowna resident. Spears had hired the girl as a housekeeper, and when she had arrived at Spears' shack, Spears proceeded to sexually assault the young woman. Spears was initially charged with indecent assault, but later convicted with a reduced charge of common assault due to the lack of evidence presented at the jury. Spears served 16 months for the crime and was released March 15, 1964. The release was very controversial among people who were familiar with Spears, but due to the laws at the time of his release, the hands of prison officials were tied. In a report published around the time of his release, Spears was described as dangerous and likely to kill by prison officials. Spears was asked to enter a mental institution voluntarily at the time of his release. Government facilities to confine these types of sexual predators were not yet in place by this time. Spears refused, stating he'd had enough of being in custody. The release concerned many. Newspapers published stories, potential killer to be set loose, men like Spears need supervision, and this man is dangerous and likely to kill. He wasn't just thought to be dangerous, Spears himself had threatened to kill upon his release. The controversial decision raised worrisome legal conflicts between individual rights and the protection of the community. After his release in 1964, it took just over a year for Spears to wind up on the wrong side of the law once again. On April 9th, 17-year-old Beverly Charest was invited to the now 59-year-old's cabin with the promise of a babysitting job. Beverly arrived at the desolate cabin at roughly 9:40. I thought of running away after I saw the cabin. I was afraid, Beverly stated during an inquest into the night's events. Details of what happened that night have been omitted from most news publications due to the graphic nature. From information available, Beverly told of being held against her will and sexually molested. Come 6:30 a.m., Beverly was able to slip away from Spears and ask the neighbor Alan Weber for help in escaping Spears. He subsequently called the police, unbeknownst to Spears. Beverly then returned to the cabin in an attempt to hide her interaction with Weber. It's unclear how Spears was alerted to the interaction between the two, though upon finding out what Beverly had told the neighbor, Spears made Beverly write 2 oaths of secrecy. The first oath was in relation to the assault and molestation, and the second was about the money she had received from Spears. This was the only time a monetary exchange was mentioned in the reporting, and it's not known what the mentioned money was for. When Beverly had finished writing the oaths, Spears folded them up and put them into his pocket before making the girl kiss a Bible. After the Bible had been returned to Spears, Constable Neil Bruce was approaching the cabin to investigate the call by Alan Weber. Bruce was accompanied by Constable Kenneth Jones, though he had yet to approach the cabin. Constable Neil Bruce was quickly spotted by Spears through the porch window as he was approaching the cabin. Upon seeing the RCMP constable, Spears swiftly moved to his .22 caliber rifle sitting adjacent to the porch window, trading it for the Bible. He raised the rifle. "Don't shoot him," yelled Beverly. He fired, alerting Constable Jones and striking Neil Bruce in the chest, piercing his right lung. Constable Bruce collapsed and took cover behind some nearby bales of hay. "I'm shot. I've had it. Don't let them get you," he yelled. Inside the cabin, moments after firing at Constable Bruce, Spears turned his gun on Beverly. "Don't shoot me," she pleaded. "I warned you," said Spears, before firing 3 shots at the 17-year-old. The first of which pierced Beverly through the jaw. She fell back onto the bed, and Spears fired again. The second shot struck the girl in the shoulder, causing Beverly to lose consciousness. Spears missed the third shot. After hearing the shots from inside the cabin, Constable Kenneth Jones, the only officer assisting Neil Bruce that day, returned fire with his handgun before calling for assistance, striking Spears' dog that was on the property at the time. After the gunfire, Spears fled into the heavily wooded area surrounding the cabin, leaving Beverly and Constable Bruce at the scene. This would be the start to one of the biggest manhunts in British Columbia history as of 1965. After the shooting, officers arrived in droves. Beverly and Constable Bruce were rushed to hospital, both undergoing surgery for their severe injuries. Constable Neil Bruce underwent emergency surgery in which the surgeon successfully removed the bullet and reinflated the constable's lung. Both were stable, though Beverly's injuries were grievous. A search area was quickly established, focusing on the heavily wooded area surrounding the cabin. 50 police officers from 5 detachments led the search, aided by 3 tracking dogs, a helicopter, and a plane. Heavily armed officers patrolled the ground surrounding the cabin, finding no trace of the armed fugitive. Come nightfall, roving road patrols were utilized to search for any movement. Spears was known to be an experienced outdoorsman, able to live off the land and survive for many days without aid, making the search all the more frustrating for the RCMP. By the 11th of April, 2 days since the start of the search, courts officially filed a warrant for the arrest of Spears for 2 charges of attempted murder, as both Constable Bruce and Beverly were appearing to recover in the hospital. With still no trace of Spears, more officers and dogs were required in the following days. The search continued through the 12th and 13th with no trace of Spears. On the 14th of April, Beverly was fit to testify to a coroner's jury about the event, though 2 hours before the hearing, the jury had received news that Constable Neil Bruce passed due to complications relating to his injuries. The 26-year-old constable seemed to be recovering from his injury in hospital when he suddenly took a turn for the worse and passed on the 14th. His death was attributed to pneumonitis as a result of the shooting. Still unable to speak from the shooting, Beverly was forced to write her statements. She was one of 5 witnesses that testified against Spears that day. Due to the sensitive details in relation to the case, details from the inquest were not publicly divulged, though the warrant for Spears would be upgraded to capital murder and attempted murder that day. From the 15th to the 18th, Spears was still at large. Sightings were reported from the Burnaby and Port Moody area on the 16th, and on the 17th, sightings were reported in the Greater Vancouver area, over 600 kilometers away. That same day, at 3 p.m., a funeral was held for Constable Neil Bruce with full military honors, in which he was buried. Funeral attendance was 500, including 50 RCMP officers, accompanied by the head of the Department of Forestry in British Columbia. With the manhunt still underway and still no trace of the fugitive, police began to look into the sighting reports, though all were quickly proven false. Another day passes with no leads into the location of Spears. Police were losing hope as Spears had now been on the run for over a week. With his outdoor experience, Spears was thought to be long gone by this time. Another day passes with no leads into the location of Spears. Police were losing hope as Spears had now been on the run for over a week. With his outdoor experience, Spears was thought to be long gone by this time. As hope continued to dwindle, police received a report from the husband of Mrs. Haskell. Mrs. Maynard Haskell, a property owner outside of Kelowna, claimed to have seen Spears crossing a 20-foot clearing near her home, 11 kilometers away from Kelowna, in Okanagan Valley, on the 19th of April. After 9 days with no sightings or leads, police knew that this could be their last chance to bring Spears into custody. Corporal George Hawkins of the RCMP, assisted by numerous armed officers and accompanied by his police dog, converged on Okanagan Valley. Upon a brief search, Spears was located hiding within a thick brush off Oatman Road. Tension was high, and the officers were unsure how much ammunition Spears was in possession of. A standoff ensued, though no shots were fired. George Hawkins was quick to deploy his police dog, flushing Spears from hiding into a clearing. In an instant, Spears raised his rifle and fired one last time, too quickly for officers to attempt to disarm the fugitive. Spears shot himself between the eyes, dying instantly on the 19th of April, 1965, at the age of 59 years old. Within an instant, one of the biggest manhunts in British Columbia history came to an end. His victims and residents of the surrounding areas could breathe easy for the first time in over a week. 9 days of hard work from the British Columbia RCMP had paid off in an instant. Upon his death, the pending case against Spears was dropped, and the victims of Spears were allowed to move on without having to face the man that had such a negative impact on their lives. The registration of death for Russell William Spears was filed on the 21st of April. his official cause of death after autopsy was attributed to fracture of the skull due to or consequence of severe brain damage due to or consequence of a gunshot wound. Spears' siblings, Gordon and Ethel, were contacted upon his death, though they denied responsibility for the body. Consequently, Spears was buried in the Kelowna City Cemetery, though it's unclear if he lies in a marked grave. The tragic death of Constable Neil Bruce demonstrated a tragic necessity for changing Canadian law. The case demonstrated a legal conflict between individual rights and protection of the public. In May of 1965, Vancouver Province made a public statement. Individual rights are of great importance, yet surely even more important is the protection of the innocent. Somehow, a more realistic balance must be found. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms was signed and enacted in 1982, henceforth banning death as an acceptable form of capital punishment nationwide, meaning at the time, if sufficient evidence was present, Spears could have been subject to death throughout his criminal career. In 1948, Criminal Code RSC 1927, Chapter 36 was enacted. This allowed those fitting the following definition of sexual psychopath to be, quote, subject to such disciplinary and reformative treatment as may be prescribed by penitentiary regulations, unquote, for an indeterminate amount of time. Quote, in this section, criminal sexual psychopath means a person who by a course of misconduct in sexual matters has evidenced a lack of power to control his sexual impulses and who as a result is likely to attack or otherwise inflict injury, loss, pain, or other evil onto any person, unquote. Those labeled as such are evaluated at least once every 3 years by the Minister of Justice in the applicable jurisdiction to determine if the incarcerated individual is to be released. Before the enactment of this law in 1948, Spears was charged with assault with intent to commit rape. Due to the crime taking place before the amendment was applicable in November, Spears was unable to be labeled as a sexual psychopath at this time. This meant Spears was only eligible for a maximum of 2 years incarceration. Spears' 2 former sex crimes were also not applicable under this amendment as they took place in 1935 and 1938 respectively. Additionally, due to the time frame at play, Spears was unable to be convicted pursuant from Section 211 through 217 of the mentioned amendment. The following sections had an opportunity to add anywhere from 1 to 6 additional years to his 2-year incarceration. Jumping to 1962, Spears was arrested on a charge of indecent assault of an 18-year-old girl. This case had the opportunity to define the remainder of Spears' life if enough evidence was presented to a jury. Due to the secretive nature of sex crime trials for the protection of the victim involved, information on the evidence presented to the jury is not available. Though what we do know, for whatever reason, the charge of indecent assault did not stick despite sexual overtones in the evidence provided, meaning the charge was reduced to common assault. This again meant that Spears was unable to be legally defined as a sexual psychopath and was convicted with the maximum sentence of 2 years. Through his final incarceration, Spears was quoted with saying that teenage girls obsessed him and upon his release he would kill. Numerous reports from the time provided from high-ranking prison officials stated that Spears was deemed dangerous and likely to kill, and under no circumstance should he be released. Again, the law at the time failed to keep Spears in custody. The aforementioned amendment regarding the definition of sexual psychopath was inapplicable and the hands of court officials were tied, meaning Spears was again permitted to walk free to the dismay of those familiar with the man. Upon Spears' release in 1964, the British Columbia Minister of Health announced that the provincial government was considering opening a forensic clinic with the aim of rehabilitation and mental health support for men like Spears. The clinic would function alongside the government, keeping those defined as sexually dangerous in custody indefinitely, with release being determined on an individual basis. With the efforts of the BC Parent-Teacher Federation, the John Howard Society, and Dr. Anthony Marcus, the Provincial Mental Health Act was enacted, allowing courts to order incarceration in forensic clinics streamlined to deal with sexually aggressive individuals. The campaigns to construct further forensic clinics were further aided by the crimes of Russell Spears and the tragic string of events that led to the death of Constable Neil Bruce and the shooting of Beverly Charest. In present day, forensic clinics are commonly used to incarcerate people like Spears, and Canadian law has been and will continue to be further refined. Though tragic and unnecessary, the crimes of Russell Spears and the death of Neil Bruce help refine Canadian law and legislation, ensuring another similar chain of events does not take place. In death, Constable Neil Bruce's sacrifice lives on in permanent legislation through his 2 children and by the middle school named in his honor. The failure of Canadian legislation didn't go without scrutiny during the time. The public outrage and tragic hindsight into Constable Bruce's death will forever leave an impact on Canadian legislation and the hearts of those who knew Constable Bruce.